Las Cruces is experiencing a drastic reduction in the number of asylum seekers from Central America coming to our community, and the shelter leased by the city is no longer used to house them. The latest on the asylum seeker situation in Las Cruces in this edition of ASTA. With us is Battalion Chief Michael Daniels with the Las Cruces Fire Department, who for a time headed operations at the Asylum Seekers Shelter. Chief Daniels, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, since early August, the number of asylum seekers coming to Las Cruces was drastically decreased. What happened?
So the U.S. government started issuing or really enforcing the MPP protocol. It's the Migrant Protection Protocol program. And people who spoke Spanish, and it came down to, it didn't matter where they crossed the border, they were able to be returned to Mexico. So even people crossing outside of the port of entry, which those were the people we were primarily getting in Las Cruces, were ones who crossed outside of the ports of entry, and even they could be returned to Mexico. And so anybody who spoke Spanish was able to be released back in Mexico or returned to Mexico, which was where you heard the majority of people crossing are going to be brought back to Mexico. For a while, there were several Mexican national citizens who were being released on their own recognizance, and they were coming into Las Cruces, as well as Brazilians. And even that sporadically changed when in October, the beginning of October, when the federal government ended what their quote unquote the catch and release program. So everybody is primarily either being returned or being retained in detention. In my understanding, families are still being released, but just not through our system here. There's capacity in other shelters.
Okay, so we began receiving asylum seekers on April 12th. During that period, how many total have come through Las Cruces?
So since April, we've received a little over 17,000 people. And just point of clarification, we've actually been receiving in Las Cruces far beyond that, far before that, with our local nonprofits, our local faith-based organizations. They've been receiving and caring for asylum seekers for the better part of a year prior. What happened is the system became so saturated that it exceeded everybody's capacity, which then forced releases into the community, which Las Cruces stepped up and actually managed that program actively instead of having people released onto the streets.
And that's a good point of clarification, so thank you. Again, we had been receiving them all along, we just became super saturated at that point.
Yes.
So we had no choice. And you raised a good point about the community stepping up, and kudos to you and the fire department, because you were, if you will, the first guys online, guys and ladies on the front lines of this thing. So when you talk about resources, how much money has been spent by Las Cruces or the City of Las Cruces so far in this effort?
So the City of Las Cruces spent approximately $1.3 million. Of that, though, $500,000 was received through grant money from the state. So we were able to use some state funds that were redistributed for this effort. And then $75,000 of that 1.3 actually went to local nonprofits to help them recuperate some of their costs or some of their expenditures that they've had during this process as well in helping.
Okay, and so when you said a lot of the nonprofits, faith-based groups were receiving asylum seekers, all along, they really stepped up in this effort. And how big of a role did they play?
Probably, they were instrumental. One, they had the experience that we had, and several of our churches have been working through the Annunciation Houses network and receiving releases. So they were able to provide us with the framework, the education we needed to understand the process. Most of us, firefighters, we've been in the fire service, and we run emergency response. We've never, I'm speaking for myself, I never thought this would be something that I would have to be a part of, or so they were the backbone of that process, of the education process, and we received help from, there's a number of organizations who locally, and they form what we call our hospitality coalition here. And they meet together, they communicate, they work together, they share resources, processes, and protocols. And they extended what they were already doing to us to assist us in our process as well, so we weren't starting completely from scratch.
Okay, and so when you talk about these processes and when we talk about the Armory on the Brown Road, that location, the city actually leased it or started leasing
Correct.
it, right? And that's where we were housing and processing the asylum seekers. So what types of processes were taking place there? I know there were medical checkups and, you know, but give us an idea of what all took place there, because it was quite an operation.
It was a very, very complicated operation in the fact that we would receive people from U.S. Border Patrol, which were the releases. We would have to gather their information, provide them a reception type speech where we explained to them what was happening, what their basic rights were, what we were going to do, our entire process. We got them set up so that if they were staying with us, we would get them a change of clothes, get them showered, get them a bed, get them blankets, head count so we can feed, coordinating meals, an evaluation of their health status as well, which was huge. In Las Cruces, we were just talking about this the other day in a review, and our process for treating people here in southern New Mexico and making sure that, you know, if somebody was sick, they got the proper care without taxing our medical system was probably one of the biggest things we could have done. We didn't suffer the same lessons learned as other areas.
And when you talk about medical treatment, one of the things I know you identified or you talked about were we had a lot of gastrointestinal issues with these folks. Tell us a little bit about that.
So, and it's what would be expected. You know, anytime somebody travels, they say, you know, don't drink the water, or, you know, be careful what you eat. And it's no different for people coming to the United States. They're not used to, or their bodies aren't used to the diets that we have here in the U.S. So when they come up here, sometimes we make some assumptions that everybody is going to be able to adapt well to what we're eating here. And we also made those assumptions, and so some people ended up with some GI issues, and we really worked hard with the New Mexico Department of Health, in addition to the Hospitality Coalition to help develop a diet that was
more indigenous to what they're used to.
Easier for them to process. It may not have been exactly the same, but it was easier for them to process, and it really kept them from getting ill. And then outside of that, we had a screening process at the facility with a doctor's orders. So if somebody was sick, it didn't mean they automatically had to go to the hospital. We were able to keep them at the facility and receive treatment there so that they didn't end up in our emergency rooms unless it was an actual emergency. So,
and that's a good point, because the way they got transported to the hospital was by ambulance, right? So we didn't have people necessarily putting them in private vehicles. And so when you
Correct.
talk about taxing our ambulance service, this is kind of what you're referring to,
Yes.
right? So do you have an idea how many were actually transported by ambulance?
I don't have exact numbers.
Okay, and that's fine, but just so an understanding by the community that they were taken care of,
Yes.
you know, properly, and we were
Yes.
looking after
Oh yes,
them.
absolutely.
Yeah.
We and early on, and so our primary response agency in the City of Las Cruces in Doña Ana County is American Medical Response, and so they are the first ones dispatched to the medical calls. They're dispatched with fire departments, but the responsibility for transportation to the hospital is primarily theirs. So early on, through collaboration, we worked it out with them. The Las Cruces Fire Department does have transport-capable ambulances, but they serve as a backup to the system. So in lieu of taking our primary response units out of service to handle transports of asylum seekers, what we did is we agreed that the fire department would use their ambulances for all transport, not only to the hospital, but back from the hospital to the shelters. So we didn't have people without resources just being released indiscriminately from the hospitals. And we worked that out with the hospitals. Memorial Medical Center, who we dealt with primarily during that time, was very good at ensuring there was a solid communication loop on when people would be released, so we could have an ambulance there to bring people back to the shelter. And American Medical Response was always there and said, hey, look, if you guys run out, or if your ambulances are busy, we'll still go out there.
Okay.
So it was a big community effort on the 911 system, on the medical system, to make sure that, one, we met the needs of the people that were being brought in and released here in Las Cruces without sacrificing the needs of our citizens.
And that's an important point to make, because I know there were some concerns in the community that was happening, that these asylum seekers were taking a lot of the resources, and we were depriving homeless veterans, for instance, and they were coming for. But all of those needs were still being met, right? Nobody got deprived anything because of the resources that were given to the asylum seekers.
Correct, and that's one of the reasons why we really focused hard to not use Gospel Rescue Mission as much. And we used them early on in April. We used them for about 2 weeks very heavily. But we really tried to filter that out, and it wasn't because we didn't want asylum seekers there, but we didn't want to affect our local population of homeless people, and we didn't want them to feel displaced. And Gospel Rescue Mission also had that concern, which is a legitimate concern. When we have a resident homeless population, or a resident population who is underserved and needs services, if they don't feel like they can go to the places that are designated in our community for them, then they're stuck without resources. So we really tried to take into account the entire system, and it was the same with housing people at El Caldito and Community of Hope,
Yeah.
because a lot of our homeless populations, that's where they go for the resources they need. So we really worked hard as a team to make sure we weren't overtaxing those areas, so at least over the long run. In the short run, we were just completely overwhelmed, and it was all hands on deck, so to speak. And then as soon as we got some stability, we stabilized, and we were able to really look at the system as a whole and find out how we can help everybody without robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Okay. So going back to the Armory on Brown Road, now that we're not housing as many people, what is the future of that facility and it's the use it was serving?
So right now, I'm not entirely sure what's going to be the result of it. We do have a lease until December, and then in December, I think we have to decide, or coming soon, we'll have to decide whether or not we want to maintain that facility for storage or for use just in case something happens, or whether or not we're going to allow the lease to expire, and then maybe sit around and regroup and say, hey, if something does change, what's our plan of action? And at least now we have some relevant experience to sit and make informed decisions, because we have an idea of what I believe of how bad it could get. We weren't receiving a small number of people. We were receiving at one point 200 plus people every day, 7 days a week, especially during the latter part of May and early June. So we immediately spiked. We went from 130 people a day in April to 180 people a day in May average, and on up. And early June was in the 200s to start. So
right now the Armory is primarily used for storage, is that correct?
It's just being used as storage right now.
And those are for resources for the NGOs, non-government organizations, faith-based groups.
Yes.
If they need supplies, they can
Correct.
go. Okay.
And we used it as a centralized hub, so also working with our partner area. Deming also received a lot of people, so working with some of the NGOs, we used the space we had at Brown Road to have resources for the area, not just Las Cruces and Doña Ana County.
Okay, so just to wrap up, this is a lessons learned experience for all of us. Certainly, you
Yes,
pointed out fire
absolutely.
department. You're used to responding to emergencies. You were kind of put into a position that you had not experienced in the past, and so now you and the City of Las Cruces, other government organizations, should this ever happen again, we're going to be prepared for it.
I believe we have a framework to start looking at how we can respond and mitigate it more efficiently, because there were lessons learned throughout the process, and that's the good thing. It also was a very good exercise in getting the county, the city, and our Office of Emergency Management in the same room, talking, trying to speak the same language, and I think we made some very good progress in ensuring that we do have good interoperability among our community partners.
Okay. Well, Battalion Chief Michael Daniels of the Las Cruces Fire Department, thank you and all your comrades again for all the effort you put into it and to help make this a smooth operation. So thank you very much, and thank you for joining us on ASTA.
Thank you.